Richard never imagined his life could crumble so rapidly. At 39, he believed he had built a solid foundation with Margaret, 35, his wife of 12 years, and mother to their two beautiful children, Emily, 9, and James, 7. The troubles began when Margaret started a new job about 5 months ago. There, she formed friendships with a group of women who held radical feminist views. Richard initially dismissed it, even finding humor in the situation. But over the past 2 months, he noticed alarming changes in his wife's behavior. "You were born wicked because men have historically oppressed women," she declared during yet another unprovoked argument. Richard would respond bewilderedly, "But I've never done anything to hurt you. My only fault is loving you." Yet the following day, the cycle would repeat itself. About 5 weeks ago, he sensed something serious was happening. Margaret returned home late one night without warning, wouldn't answer her phone, was somewhat intoxicated, and behaved coldly and distantly. The next day, she brushed off his concerns. "You're too controlling. Don't create problems where none exist." This pattern repeated several times. Richard tried to check her phone, but couldn't find anything definitive, though he noticed many messages had been deleted. However, he discovered a conversation with one of her new friends discussing how Margaret should approach talking to him about an open relationship. Richard's instincts told him the worst was happening. She was being unfaithful. On what would become a pivotal Monday in December, with their children visiting grandparents for an early Christmas celebration, Margaret attempted to casually broach the subject over breakfast. "I've been thinking," she said with practiced nonchalance. "What are your thoughts about an open relationship?" Richard was prepared. He had already started recording the conversation, having read extensively about similar situations. He knew there was little hope of salvaging their marriage. His priority now was protecting himself and their children while preserving some dignity. He didn't yell or scream. Instead, he went directly into a stern interrogation mode with his jaw clenched. Margaret had been cocky until that moment, but her confidence evaporated when she saw the look on his face. "Who is he?" Richard asked firmly. "What do you mean?" Margaret attempted to look innocent. "If you want to have this conversation, don't treat me like a fool. At least have the decency to be honest. If you can't be honest, what's the point of discussing our relationship?" "What do you mean?" she repeated. "If you lie to me now, we cannot have the discussion you want about our relationship. I can tell you're hiding something. It's obvious. So who is the man you're seeing?" "I'm not. My God, there's more than one, isn't there?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Don't lie. You've completely destroyed my trust. Either be honest and we talk this through, or I divorce you. Our marriage ends right now. No arguments, no discussion, nothing. Just divorce. Do you understand?" After a long pause, Margaret finally admitted to 2 one-night stands while out with her friends. Richard questioned her about these men, their names, whether they were married, if she had used protection. Both were married men with families of their own. Then she revealed she was planning to sleep with a co-worker, insisting this was good for her and that Richard had no right to control her. She explained that she would set Richard up with one of her friends who was really keen. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked for her phone, and she showed him the pattern to unlock it. While she went to the bathroom, he locked himself in his office. Margaret pounded on the door while Richard ran recovery software on the phone, retrieving numerous deleted messages and installing monitoring software. When he emerged, he handed her the phone and told her to leave. She argued vehemently, showing no remorse whatsoever. "You're acting controlling. You're holding me back, just like men have always held women back. You never loved me. I have every right to do this." "It isn't a big deal," she shouted as Richard silently packed her bags. He eventually stood at the front door, saying nothing until she ran out of steam. Reluctantly, she went to her parents' house. As she descended the stairs, Richard called after her. "You're single now. You can do whatever you want. I'm not controlling you anymore." When she turned to respond, he simply slammed and locked the door. Later, Richard monitored as Margaret discussed the situation with her friends. They told her how strong she was for demanding what she deserved, how she should expect better than Richard, and that his threats were empty. He wouldn't go through with the divorce. What truly alarmed Richard was how these friends advised Margaret that she could accuse him of domestic abuse if necessary. One explained how she had ruined her ex-husband's life with false allegations. Richard immediately ordered security cameras for his house, realizing he needed to document everything. Then Margaret began messaging her affair partner to arrange a meeting at a hotel. Richard was stunned by her brazenness. He searched online for the man's wife, quickly found and befriended her on Facebook, and told her everything, including the ongoing hotel rendezvous. The woman thanked Richard and hung up. Hours later, she sent him a video. She had gone to the hotel and confronted them. From the shouting, it was clear this wasn't her husband's first infidelity. "You worthless snake! You do this to me again? To our children again? I told you we were finished if you ever did this again." The video showed Margaret getting dressed at the edge of the bed. Richard vomited when he first saw the footage. The other man's wife slapped Margaret and berated her before the video ended. Richard messaged Margaret, "I saw the video from the hotel. Never come near me again." Margaret's response shocked him. She seemed to view their interactions as some sort of competition that she was winning. She appeared completely detached from reality, not grasping that they were truly divorcing. Richard logged into his wife's family WhatsApp group and informed them they were divorcing due to her infidelity. He thanked them for welcoming him into their family before leaving the group. He received several calls and messages from her relatives, but couldn't bring himself to respond. He called his parents and explained everything. His father immediately messaged Margaret that she would not be welcome for Christmas. Richard went to stay with his parents and spoke with his boss, who gave him time off until mid-January. Richard continued monitoring Margaret's increasingly frantic discussions with her new friends. She seemed unable to comprehend that she had lost her family and that her marriage was over. She sent numerous messages and even showed up at his parents' house, demanding to be allowed to celebrate Christmas with them. Richard's father threatened to call the police if she didn't leave. Now searching for divorce lawyers and weeping uncontrollably, Richard struggled to make sense of it all. The pain became overwhelming when he reached his parents' house. He responded to Margaret's messages only twice. "It doesn't matter what you say. I don't know who you are. You're not my wife. My wife would never destroy my heart and soul while smiling. We will get a divorce. I don't care what you say or what you want. You have no influence or right to demand anything from me ever again. We are over." And later, "As I said, you are not my wife. I don't know you. My wife would never condemn our children to the pain and suffering of growing up in a broken home. You, whoever you are, seem proud of what you've done. My wife was loving, caring, considerate, my best friend. You are a self-obsessed, self-absorbed abomination." The messages stopped after this last exchange. The pain became unbearable at times. Richard wished none of this had happened, that he could return to the way things were before, but he knew he couldn't do that to himself. It was the worst Christmas of his life. When the children asked when their mother would arrive, Richard blurted out the truth. Their mother didn't want to be a family anymore. She wanted to be with other men, and they would get divorced. They were naturally distraught, but fortunately, Richard's parents were there to shower them with love and affection while he tried to pull himself together. Richard knew he needed to recover for his children's sake, but he would never return to Margaret. The level of disrespect and callousness in her behavior was unforgivable. He remained bewildered by her expectation that she could demand anything from him at this point. As days passed, Richard's obsession with Margaret's communications with her friends grew. What broke him was when he found messages where she described, in harsh language, how her marriage and especially her children were burdens that prevented her from being a successful woman living up to her full potential. She claimed Richard was an oppressive presence, holding her back from a good life, suggesting her family was the reason she didn't have a successful career and a more exciting social life. Richard spent over 30 hours reading and rereading every line of emails and chats. Upon reflection, he realized she never provided any specific examples of how they were burdens or how he was oppressive. just blanket statements without supporting arguments. In reality, Richard had never stopped her from doing anything. He paid for almost everything. Her part-time job's minimal wage wouldn't support anyone. He had encouraged her hobbies, dreams, and aspirations, even when she enrolled in class after class only to drop out halfway through. He had made sure to show his love daily, appreciating everything she did for the family, romancing her, taking her out, being there whenever she needed him. Eventually, Richard collapsed from exhaustion. When he awoke, his three best friends, Michael, Robert, and Frank, were in the kitchen with his father preparing dinner. These lifelong friends had been invited by Richard's father, who had updated them on the situation. Michael, an ex-military man who had lost his left arm below the elbow, connected Richard with his counselor, who had helped him when his own wife had abandoned him during his recovery. The counselor explained that Richard should view part of his identity as tied to his marriage and role as a husband. That part was now dead, and just as an amputee suffers phantom pain, Richard would feel phantom pain from this loss. Robert, an executive at a security company, arranged for Richard to speak with a top-tier lawyer that Sunday morning, someone Richard could never normally afford. Robert assured him not to worry about the cost. He was happy to finally repay Richard for the many times Richard had protected him from bullies in their youth. Frank, a teacher at a private school with 7 children of his own, made sure Richard's children were well cared for while he gathered his strength and organized his affairs. The situation worsened when Richard discovered Margaret had given him a sexually transmitted infection. His self-pity transformed into pure anger. The lawyer managed to track down the ex-husband of Margaret's feminist friend, the one who had bragged about destroying her ex through false claims. This man provided valuable insight into what Richard could expect and what he needed to prepare for. Meanwhile, Margaret's bizarre behavior continued. During a video call meant to discuss divorce arrangements, she opened with an absurd statement about male anatomy, then mused about looking forward to exploring this topic with various men once pandemic restrictions lifted. When Richard refused to become angry, she grew hostile, cursing him simply for being a man. Throughout the call, Richard sensed she still viewed this as some kind of game, believing she was in control and that he had no choice but to accept whatever she wanted. They made no progress on the divorce, so Richard concluded, "Fine, a contested divorce it is then. By the way, you gave me an STI, and unlike you, I haven't been sleeping with anyone else. You should get yourself to a clinic." She merely frowned in response. Richard sent the recording to his lawyer, who was shocked by Margaret's behavior. Despite his outward strength, Richard continued to struggle emotionally. He cried himself to sleep every night, grieving his own loss and the fact that his children would grow up in a broken home. It broke his heart that his children effectively no longer had a functional relationship with their mother. How do you answer when your child asks, "Why doesn't mommy want to see me anymore? Doesn't she love me?" Richard wondered, finding no adequate response. Margaret remained oblivious to Richard's monitoring of her communications. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. She remained convinced that he would never leave her, and that his reaction to her behavior was entirely unjustified. She continued speaking negatively about Richard, their marriage, and even their children to her friends. Richard's lawyer secured a temporary restraining order against Margaret, though it wasn't extended when no new direct threats emerged. The lawyer suggested using Margaret's knowing infection of Richard with an STI as leverage to persuade her to agree to an uncontested divorce. Richard desperately wished they could separate reasonably. He hated viewing her as an enemy and always assuming the worst possible outcome. If she wanted to leave me, I could live with that, he thought. But why force me into this extremely adversarial process? Why does she try so hard to hurt the very people who once loved her? What possible gain could she have from this? Finally, a meeting was arranged with Margaret and her representative. She arrived 30 minutes late without a lawyer, bringing one of her radical friends instead. Throughout the meeting, both women attempted to provoke and insult Richard, laughing at their own crude remarks, while his lawyer tried to steer the conversation toward the divorce settlement. When Richard's lawyer mentioned that he was willing to pay a generous lump sum of $60,000 for a quick, peaceful resolution, Margaret became excited and wanted to sign immediately, without reviewing the rest of the agreement. She was more interested in getting the money and reaching the bar than in understanding what she was signing. Surprisingly, within minutes, the paperwork was notarized. and Margaret departed without even taking her copy of the agreement. Richard was stunned by how easily it had concluded. He would receive full custody with only a one-time payment and no spousal support. Richard's lawyer warned him to maintain a low profile, continue paying for everything as usual, and avoid rocking the boat until the hearing. Don't talk to anyone you both know. Sit still and wait. Don't respond to anything. Zero initiative until the hearing, she advised. The situation took a dramatic turn when police officers arrived at Richard's home with a search warrant. Protecting his children, he arranged for them to wait outside while the officers searched his house. He later learned that Margaret and her three radical friends had driven his car while intoxicated and high on drugs, crashing into a house at high speed. All were arrested, and the friend in the passenger seat was in critical condition. When Richard returned inside after the police left, he broke down at the sight of his completely ransacked home. His father quickly organized a group of 26 friends and relatives who cleaned and repaired the entire house, while Richard recovered at his parents' home. Meanwhile, police discovered more drugs at the home of Margaret's friend Harriet, the one who had boasted about destroying her ex-husband. Her children were home alone, resulting in Child Protective Services granting temporary emergency custody to her ex-husband, Henry, who had barely seen his children in 5 years due to Harriet's false allegations. On Sunday, Richard received a call from Margaret's parents. Their house had also been searched, and after visiting their daughter in jail, they no longer trusted anything she told them. She had been lying to them about everything, claiming she was staying with Richard and they were working things out. They had no idea what was actually happening or what she had done to Richard and the children. Margaret called Richard on Monday, asking him to post her $15,000 bail. After consulting with his lawyer, Richard arranged for the bail amount to be subtracted from the settlement, with Margaret's mother as custodian of the remaining amount. Upon release, Margaret refused to comply with her parents' conditions for continued residence, stopping drug use, committing to rehabilitation, and cutting ties with her problematic friends. She left their house to stay with her new friends and didn't show up for the divorce hearing. After presenting everything to the judge, including the weekend's events, Richard was granted full custody. The settlement proceeded according to their agreement, and though it would take 4 to 6 months to process, the divorce was essentially finalized. Later that day, Richard received a call from the hospital. Margaret had been hospitalized following an altercation. As her emergency contact and insurance provider, Richard was notified. He brought her parents to the hospital, where they discovered that some of her new friends had severely beaten her, breaking her jaw and knocking out several teeth. Word had spread that Henry had obtained chat logs of Harriet bragging about her deception, and these people assumed Margaret had provided the logs. Richard realized she still didn't understand that he had access to monitor her phone. Margaret, now with nothing, asked if she could move back home. Richard firmly refused. Her mother refused to give her any money unless she got clean and stayed clean for at least a year, offering her residence under strict conditions. For the first time, Richard saw a glimmer of regret from Margaret, though he suspected it was merely regret that she could no longer continue her reckless behavior. "I'm sorry I ruined everything," she said, barely meeting his eyes. Richard felt torn, wanting to protect her while recognizing her dangerous, erratic behavior made her a threat to their children's well-being. Richard later learned the full extent of Margaret's downward spiral when he spoke with her hospitalized friend. This woman revealed that all of Margaret's new friends were hardcore drug users and addicts. Harriet had pulled Margaret into their group and convinced her to try drugs and party with them. Eventually, they all sold sexual favors to fund their drug habits. We preach this strong feminist, my body stuff, but it's all to protect our imagined egos. What we really do is prostitute ourselves for money to buy drugs, the woman admitted. Margaret bought into it, and it didn't take long until she was addicted just like the rest of us. She eventually started selling sex to pay for drugs. This revelation devastated Richard. The woman explained that no one visited her in the hospital because she had stolen, cheated, abused, and lied to everyone in her life. She even expressed sadness that she had survived the crash, seeing no hope for her future. Taking advice from those experienced with addicts, Richard remained vigilant about Margaret's mental state. Sure enough, while at his father's cabin with the children that weekend, he received what read like a suicide note from Margaret. She confessed to her addiction and prostitution, lamenting how she had let everyone down and indicating she planned to end her life. Richard immediately called her father and provided Margaret's location from the phone monitoring. Her father rushed out and found her unconscious on a park bench. She was taken to the hospital, severely hypothermic, and barely survived. Margaret's father successfully became her legal guardian and had her committed to a rehabilitation center for sedated detoxification. Richard offered to help with finances as long as Margaret wasn't told of his involvement. Despite everything, Richard remained deeply depressed. "This weighs heavily on my soul," he confided to friends. "What keeps me going is my friends and family, and knowing I need to stay strong for the kids. My heart breaks for Margaret. Despite everything, I don't regret marrying her. I still love her, but I know we can never be together again. She isn't the person she used to be, and there's just too much pain between us." Richard found that news of Margaret's addiction actually helped the children cope. "It's much easier to talk about how mom is sick, and it's going to take a long time for her to get well, that she still loves them," he explained. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Richard had just fallen asleep after hours of staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through endless what-ifs. The harsh ring of his phone pierced the darkness. "Sir?" The clinical voice on the other end belonged to a doctor from the rehabilitation center. "I'm sorry to inform you that Margaret has been found unresponsive in her room." Richard's entire body went cold. "Is she—" "We believe she suffered an overdose. The emergency team tried everything, but she didn't make it. I'm deeply sorry for your loss." The phone slipped from Richard's hand, clattering against the hardwood floor. He sat motionless in the darkness, unable to process the finality of those words. Margaret was gone, the mother of his children, his partner of 12 years, the woman he had built his life with, erased in an instant. Hours later, Margaret's father arrived, his face haggard with grief. Together they identified her body. Richard's legs nearly gave out as the sheet was pulled back. Margaret's face looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping. A cruel contrast to the chaos that had consumed her final months. She appeared younger somehow. The hardness that had taken over her features in recent months now melted away. "How did this happen?" Richard whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "She was supposed to be safe here." The medical examiner believed Margaret had somehow smuggled drugs into the facility, possibly swallowing a package that later burst. Tests would later confirm a lethal dose of fentanyl. No one could say for certain how she obtained the substances in such a controlled environment. That night, after arranging for his parents to watch the children, Richard sat alone in his car in the rehabilitation center's parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The dam finally broke. He screamed until his throat was raw, pounding the dashboard with such force that he fractured 2 knuckles. Years of love, pain, betrayal, and now grief poured out of him in violent waves. "Why?" he roared into the empty car. "Why couldn't you just get help? Why did you have to leave them like this? Leave me like this?" When his voice gave out and his tears ran dry, Richard sat in hollow silence. Dawn was breaking on the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. Telling Emily and James was the hardest thing Richard had ever done. He gathered them in the living room of his parents' house, his father and mother flanking them on either side. "Mommy was very, very sick," he began, his voice trembling. Sometimes when people are so sick, the medicines can't make them better. Emily's eyes widened. Is Mommy with the angels now? She asked, her small voice cutting through Richard like a blade. Richard could only nod, pulling both children into his arms as they began to sob. James clung to him with surprising strength, his little body shaking. Did she not want to get better? To come home to us? James asked between hiccuping sobs. Richard felt the weight of his son's questions crushing his chest. Sometimes the sickness makes it hard to think clearly. Mommy loved you both so much. The sickness just made it hard for her to show it the right way. The funeral was small. Many who had once called themselves friends of Margaret had vanished once her addiction became known. Her parents sat in the front row, aged beyond their years. Richard stood with a child holding each hand, their faces solemn and confused. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Richard found himself replaying every moment of their relationship. The first awkward date where she had laughed so hard at his jokes that soda came out her nose. The night he proposed by the lake, stars reflected in her eyes. The birth of their children, Margaret's face glowing with exhausted joy as she held each newborn. These memories collided violently with more recent ones. Her cruel words, her betrayals, her descent into addiction. Richard struggled to reconcile these two versions of the woman he had loved. The weeks that followed passed in a blur. Richard functioned on autopilot, ensuring the children were fed, bathed, and got to school on time. At night when they were asleep, he would sit in the dark kitchen, staring at old family photos. One evening about a month after the funeral, Richard found Emily sitting on her bed, holding her mother's perfume bottle. I'm trying to remember her smell, Emily said quietly. I don't want to forget. Richard sat beside her, his heart breaking all over again. We won't forget her, he promised. The real her, the one who baked cookies with you every Sunday, the one who knew all the words to your favorite songs. Emily leaned against him. Was it our fault she got sick, Daddy? No, sweetheart, Richard said firmly, wrapping his arm around her small shoulders. It was nobody's fault. Sometimes people get lost, and they can't find their way back no matter how much their family loves them. That night, after tucking both children into bed, Richard found himself drawn to the box of Margaret's belongings he had stored in the attic. Among old birthday cards and trinkets, he found a journal he hadn't seen before. Opening it hesitantly, he recognized Margaret's handwriting from years earlier, before the drugs, before the new friends. Richard brought me flowers today for no reason, just because, he said. I don't know what I did to deserve someone who looks at me the way he does. Emily took her first steps today. Richard cried harder than I did. I love our little family so much it scares me sometimes. Tears slid down Richard's face as he read entry after entry chronicling their happiest years. This was the Margaret he had fallen in love with. The Margaret who had been consumed by addiction was almost a stranger wearing his wife's face. Later that week, Richard attended his first grief support group. He sat silently through the first session, but at the second, he finally spoke. I don't know how to grieve someone who was already gone before they died, he admitted. Part of me is angry at her for what she did to our family. Another part feels guilty for not seeing her addiction sooner. And then there's the part that still loves who she was before everything fell apart. A woman across the circle nodded knowingly. Complicated grief when there's trauma mixed with loss. Over the next few months, Richard continued therapy, both individually and with the children. He learned that it was possible to mourn the loss of Margaret while also acknowledging the pain she had caused. He didn't have to canonize her in death, nor did he need to demonize her. Spring came, bringing with it unexpected moments of joy. James scored his first goal in soccer. Emily was selected for the school choir. Richard found himself truly laughing again for the first time in nearly a year. One Saturday afternoon, as Richard watched his children playing in the backyard, Michael stopped by with coffee and donuts. "You're doing good, Rich," Michael said, nodding toward the children. "Really good." Richard sighed. "Some days I have no idea what I'm doing. I worry they'll be screwed up forever because of all this." Michael shook his head. "Kids are resilient when they're loved. And those two, they know they're loved." As summer approached, Richard made the decision to sell their house. There were too many ghosts there, too many painful memories in every corner. They found a cozy home closer to Richard's parents, with a large yard and trees perfect for climbing. On moving day, as the last boxes were loaded onto the truck, Richard took a final walk through the empty house. He paused in the master bedroom, where he and Margaret had spent countless nights dreaming of their future. He placed his palm flat against the wall. "I forgive you," he whispered. "Not for you, but for me, for our children." The new house quickly became home. Richard planted a garden with the children, each selecting flowers they thought their mother would have liked. It became their special way of remembering her, not the version consumed by addiction, but the mother who had read them bedtime stories and kissed their scraped knees. On what would have been their 14th anniversary, Richard took the children to Margaret's favorite spot by the lake. They released biodegradable lanterns into the twilight sky, watching as they floated upward, becoming indistinguishable from the emerging stars. "Is Mommy watching us?" James asked, his small hand warm in Richard's. Richard gazed up at the lanterns. "I think she is," he said softly. "The real Mommy, the one who loved us more than anything." Emily leaned against his side. "I remember her laughing, really loud. Dad, you always said she had no indoor laugh." Richard smiled, the memory washing over him like a warm wave. "That's right. She laughed with her whole body." As they walked back to the car, Richard felt something shift inside him. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of something new growing alongside it. Hope, perhaps, or the quiet certainty that they would be okay. That night, after tucking the children into bed in their new rooms, Richard sat on the porch swing, listening to the symphony of cicadas and distant traffic. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the betrayal, the pain, the loss. He thought about Margaret, not just her failings, but her kindness, her humor, the love she had once freely given. Life hadn't turned out as he'd planned. The future stretched before him, uncharted and sometimes frightening. But as Richard gazed up at the star-filled sky, he felt a strange peace settle over him. They had survived the darkest chapter. Whatever came next, they would face it together, him and his children, carrying Margaret's memory not as a burden, but as a complex part of who they were and who they would become. "We're going to be all right," he whispered to the night air. For the first time in a very long time, he truly believed it.